Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're just waiting for a few more people to come in, so as they crop in, we will admit people as we go. We'll just start off with an introduction to those of us that are here. So I'm Tracy. I'll be hosting the session today, and in today's session, we're looking at CV writing. So we'll be talking to you about all things to do with CV writing, systems, applications, and everything along those lines. Along with me today, I've got Sam, Pippa, and Kat. So we're all watching the chat as well and answering any questions that you may have. If you do ask a question in the chat or you ask anything that we don't see, feel free to raise your hand or just jump out, because as much as we are watching when there's a lot of you on screen, sometimes it's easy to miss people. Just to let you all know, we are recording the session. So hopefully everybody's okay with it being recorded. For those of you who don't want to speak or ask questions in a recorded session, there are a couple of options that we have for you to be able to join in. So one option is please feel free to use the chat box and we will watch it, and we can obviously deal with any questions anonymously that come in through chat. What we'll also do is at the end of the session, we'll stop the recording and give time with no recording on at all, where we can have kind of an open conversation. So if you have got any questions at all or anything you'd like to talk about that you're not comfortable to do with the recordings on, then please sort of stick around and we will cover those at the end. Has anybody got any questions or anything at all before we start that you'd like to cover, or is everybody happy to get going? No? Okay, brilliant. Like I say, we are watching the boxes, so please do chat. And the session's as interactive as you want it to be. So if I say something that prompts a question or there's something you'd like to ask us, please feel free to kind of do that as we go through. So don't feel like you have to wait until the end to ask anything. You know, we want you to sort of join in as much as you can and kind of gain out of this morning to people that type in the chat at the moment. Okay, so what are we looking at today? Today's session is about job searching in today's market. So we're focusing primarily today on CVs and how your CV will be assessed today. Now, one of the main ways which some of you may or may not be familiar with is ATS systems. And in terms of recruitment and recruitment processes today, ATSs are really, really important. They're a really important part of your job search. They're a really important part of shortlisting. So we'll just talk a little bit about the systems, what they mean, what they do. And then for the rest of the time, we'll actually look at your own CV. So the layout and format that your CV should have, and then some kind of practical tips around how you can present your own achievements, how you can tailor your CV to roles that you apply for, and then some do's and don'ts as well. Like we say, plenty of time at the end for questions, but please do jump in and ask them. So if there's something that sort of triggers a question in your mind, don't feel you have to hold it until the end. So just to introduce myself, as I said earlier, but for those of you that have only just joined, I'm Tracy and I've run CV Prime for around about 4 years now. I've been CV writing for a lot longer and I've been in HR for about 20 years. So I've got lots of experience around kind of all aspects of recruitment. So the services that I offer cover everything from CV writing through to personal statements, interview coaching, so kind of the full spectrum. I'm an HR professional by background, so I do tend to pick up a lot of HR CVs, but I do help people of all sectors. And what you'll find as we go through today is the most important thing about your CV is the skills and the words. So hopefully I can give you tips that will cover kind of every industry that will help you in your job searches. So the big question for today is, what is a CV and why do you have one? So that's what we're kind of looking to cover. And just once more before we begin, any questions at all from anybody or anything particular that you're hoping to get out of today that you really want me to cover? No, you're all quite happy. Okay. So job searching in today's market, just to give you a few stats and a little bit of an idea of kind of what you're facing when you're job searching in today's market. So current stats show that the average employee in the UK looks for a new job every 3.5 years. So gone are the days where people used to go into a job for life and kind of stay with the same company forever. It's a very, very fluid market now in terms of job searching. And lots of people do change roles, you know, for a number of reasons. Last year, the average time from making an application to actually securing a job was 28 days. So the physical time of job searching was taking around a month from submitting that very first form to being offered the role. And it obviously then took a bit longer in terms of referencing and, you know, DBS checks and all those kind of things before you start. The number of employed Brits in the UK who are job hunting every single day is nearly 10 million. So these are people that already have jobs that are looking for a different job whilst they're employed. So that's quite a high figure. When you then look at the number on top of that aren't working, you know, it's a really massive sort of pool of people that are job searching at any given time. And pandemic, you know, since the start of the pandemic, 65% of job searchers now say they want a job that gives a sense of purpose or has a different look to their previous role. Now, from your own experiences, obviously people's experience of the pandemic has varied widely. And for yourselves, I'm assuming for a lot of you, things like remote or hybrid working may be very, very important now, as it might not have been something you would have particularly considered perhaps 5 or 10 years ago. People are considering more around the work-life balance, around flexibility, and something else that comes across now as being very, very important is reward and recognition. You know, people want to feel valued, they want to be appreciated for what they do. And when you're looking for a job yourselves, these may be some of the things that you're prioritising as being really important in your own job search. It would be interesting, and perhaps when we have a chat either later on or as we go through, to have a think about what would be your priorities. If you're going to put your top 3 or 4 things that you're looking for in a new job, do these match what you would say you're looking for yourself, or is there something else that has become a priority for you? So, as we said earlier, we're spending today looking at CVs. So we're going to look first of all at how your CVs are assessed. And there's 2 different ways that your CV will be assessed when you apply for a role. So the first way is the more traditional way, which is where a hiring manager or a recruiter will look at your CV and they will physically make a decision on whether to shortlist you based on that document that they look at. The second way, which is becoming much more common, is an ATS system or an applicant tracking system. And that is an electronic process of shortlisting, which we'll talk about in a moment, but completely takes the personal element out of it and shortlists your CV on a very system-based process. So these days, ATSs are used by approximately 98% of large organisations. They're becoming much more common. There are lots more ATS systems in the market now than there ever were before. And even a lot of small companies find that their in-house HR systems have got an inbuilt recruitment module, which runs its own ATS, which they then use to apply for shortlisting. Just a little stat here for you, that if a manager was to look at your CV or recruiter, the average time that they look at that is around 7 seconds. So it's very much at a glance and kind of make a decision on whether to shortlist you in a very kind of yes or no based on what they see. So what we will cover today is some tips for how you can tailor your CV to make sure it's ATS friendly. So it will go through the systems and it will scan through the systems. Perhaps less commonly, but equally importantly, is how we can make sure your CV stands out to a recruiter or a person that might look at it and make that very kind of quick at a glance decision. So a little bit about ATS systems. Has anybody had any experience with ATSs or had any sort of roles that you might have applied for that you've had any feedback from on ATS systems at all?
No, sorry.
Yeah, okay. You're happy to share?
Oh no, I said no. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought you had a story for us. Okay, no problem. I'll tell you about them as if you don't know anything. Obviously, if I'm telling you what you already know, then bear with me. So let me say it stands for applicant tracking systems, and they're very, very common today. Now, what these systems do is they will scan your CV against keywords, key requirements, or key skills. So you may have had it yourself where you might have applied for a job, perhaps on a website, perhaps on Indeed or LinkedIn, and you get a rejection email back within about 10 minutes. One of the main things a lot of my customers say to me is, well, I applied for a job at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night and they rejected me in 10 minutes. You know, why were they working at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night? And the answer is they weren't. It was the system. So what the systems do is they will score your CV against the requirements of the job. And they're looking, like we say, for those skills, those words, those kind of competencies to be able to put you through. So when we're talking about CVs, we'll cover this in a bit more detail, but the biggest tips with regards to system compatibility is to keep your CV jargon free, keep it functional, keep it format friendly, and keep it simple. So in your CV, it might make perfect sense to you to have some jargons that you use within your role. And often in jobs, you find abbreviations for things, or you find words that are very known to the industry, but they'll make absolutely no sense to anybody outside it. So try and avoid using those because the system will often struggle to pick them up. Keeping it format friendly, again, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later, but one of the big things that some of the systems struggle with is the fancy formatting. So you might have seen yourself where you get these CVs that are built kind of on Canva or on PDF documents, and they've got lots of colours and lots of columns and logos and photos. the systems can really, really struggle to scan all of that information. So I'll talk to you about the layout of your CV a bit later, but the biggest tip is to keep it very, very simple. So two different purposes of an ATS. So the first purpose is for data capture. Some companies will use ATSs purely to capture your data. So to capture names, addresses, your job history, and they don't actually do any shortlisting with that at all. They just capture it. And if they employ you, that then becomes your staff file. The other way is that it's used for CV scanning. So as we said before, they will physically put into the system the job description or the requirements for the role, and they will scan the CVs that come in to see if you meet those requirements. If you meet them, your application's processed, and if you don't meet them, it isn't. And it's kind of a very, very black and white methods. So what you can sometimes find with those, and like I said to you earlier, one of the most important things to consider is words. So the whole way through your job search, think about your words. You might have a role, and for example, for myself in HR, I might write my own CV, for example, and say something like, I deal with the full spectrum of employee relations cases. Now, if a person read that, they would understand that I do some absence management, I do some disciplinary, I do some recruitment. But if a system is looking for those words, so it's looking for the words absence, or it's looking for the word recruitment, it won't interpret it from that overriding sentence. So where a lot of CVs do fall down is because you haven't got enough words and enough detail to satisfy the search. Another very sort of minor but very, very classic example is your CV might be talking the whole way through about customer service. You've got good customer service skills, all the customer service focus, but the job might be an industry where they don't call them customers, they call them clients. And the job description might be looking for client satisfaction. So just ask yourself, but is it going to interpret that from what you've got in your words? And one of the biggest things to do is make sure that your CV matches the terminology or the phrases that are being used by the job or the recruiter. We just had a question on the chat for whether the slides will be sent out. We'll get some information over to you. It will certainly be in the form of a handout, and the recording will be available to watch. But we can come up with a condensed version of the slides if anybody would find that useful. So if what we send afterwards doesn't cover what you need, just let us know and we can send those over. So we're going to look a little bit now at CV layouts and formats and kind of what you should have in your CV and how you can present this in the best way. So there's some key sections that you're always going to have in every CV. So you have your personal details section or personal info, include your name, include your town or city in the first part of your postcode. So you don't need your full address on your CV. By town or city, the decision there really is how far you want your job search to be. So if, for example, you live in London, it would be enough to write London N1, for example, on the CV, because your job search would span the whole of London. If you live in a county, a bigger county like myself, for example, I'm in Essex, I wouldn't necessarily put Essex to be in my job search area because I'm at one end of the Essex and I wouldn't want to travel all the way to the other end. So it would be much better for me to put my hometown, because that will keep your search radius a bit smaller. So just have either there the town or the county or the city and the first part of your postcode. Obviously have your phone number, your email, and if you have a LinkedIn account, it's a really good idea to hyperlink it on your CV as well, because in terms of the ATSs, it does pick up that you've got different social media showing on there. The next section on the CV will be your personal profile. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but this really is the kind of snapshot to introduce you, setting the scene to who you are, what you can offer. After that, I always recommend people to have a key skills section. This is kind of very much at a glance. And like we said, coming back to that, the recruiter will look at your CV for about 7 seconds. If one of the top sections they can see on your CV is a table or a list of your key skills, excuse me, that are tailored towards what you're applying for and really show them that you can offer everything they're after, that's a really strong section to have on the CV. In terms of ATS scanning, we know that the ATSs love keywords. So that section also picks up very well in scanning. So again, we'll look at these in a moment as to what you can put in each one. This one's got a question mark after it. So do you have your achievements and your career highlights as a separate section? In CV writing, that really is the $1 million question, and there is no right answer. I always say to people, if you're trying to show your suitability for a role that perhaps you haven't worked in before, or you're changing field, or you might be in a role where you've got a lot of quantifiable achievements that you want to show kind of figures. The other section, this is really good, is if you haven't worked for a long time because of perhaps health conditions or family situation, and you want to really highlight why you're the best fit for this role, I would have this section in here, and treat this as kind of an interview question of, give us 3 reasons we should give you the job. So what are the 3 things that you would like that recruiter to know about what you can offer? And again, we'll cover this section in detail in a moment. Obviously, your career history speaks for itself, and then education and qualifications. And then the last section, which you may want, is other relevant information. So we'll have a look in a minute at what you might put in there. So in terms of your layout, that's really the sections that your CV should include. You don't need to include things like references available on request, because they will be asked for as part of the interview process. Hobbies and interests we'll talk about a little bit later, but as a rule, I would say don't include those unless they're relevant to what you're applying for. You might want in your other information things like voluntary work or other languages that you speak, or things that might add a different dimension to your application. Any questions at all so far on anything that we've covered, or are you happy now to look at each section in a bit more detail? No? Okay. So like I say, personal information, make sure you include this. It sounds really, really obvious, but it's amazing how many people forget to put their email address or their phone number on their CV. Make sure that it's easy for the recruiter to contact you back. What you don't want on your CV is any kind of personal details. So you don't need your date of birth, you don't need your marital status, you don't need your race, religion, gender, anything at all that could come under any kind of discriminatory category. It won't add anything to your application, and you may find that recruiters will remove all of that kind of information to remove any potential discrimination. So you could find that the context of that section is lost if information stripped out of it. So just keep it to those details, keep it nice and clear. Obviously, if you're hyperlinking things like LinkedIn profiles, or if you've got sort of online portfolios, for example, just make sure that your hyperlinks work. Double check that everything's in order. Okay, so that's quite a nice, easy section to start you off with. Personal profile, as we said before, this is kind of a snapshot or an introduction into who you are and what you're going to bring to this role. So around about 100 words, 6 lines. It doesn't need to be precise. It doesn't matter if it's longer or shorter, it's very much just a guideline. So this is an introduction to you, kind of a summary of your skills and who you are, and include your job title or any keywords from the advert. So if you're applying for a role that's perhaps very, very customer service heavy, and they're looking for somebody with customer service skills and somebody that's friendly and, personable and welcoming, they're all the kind of things you want them to read right up front. So remember, this is the first section of the CV that they will look at, and this is kind of their introduction into why you're applying. You probably won't need to tailor this massively for each role you apply for, because your personal profile is very much about you. But it certainly would be worth looking at it for each application and making sure that it's still suitable for the job. So that's kind of the the summary of your profile, really. Like I say, you can make them a bit longer. Some people really struggle with this and make them a lot shorter, which is absolutely fine, but just have something to introduce you at the beginning. Next section, like we say, have this as a table format. Don't have any borders on it, because as we saw a moment ago, ATSs really don't like borders. But I have around 9 to 12 keywords here, so either 3 by 3 or a 4 by 3 table. And think about what's the role looking for and what skills can you bring to it. So if you're applying for an admin role, for example, the summary of your skills might be these. So administration, customer service, working to targets, minute taking, being the first point of contact. You've got some other things on here about GDPR, report writing. So just go through that job and look at kind of what are the top 10 things that they're after and get them into this section. This is the section that you will tailor for every role. So when we talk to people about CVs, we always say it's very important not just to send out the same blanket CV for every application, but to tailor it for everything that you apply for. And the easiest way to do it is to keep this section up to date. Okay. Next section, as we say, is sort of an achievements or a career highlights section. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Personally, I like to pick out 3 subheadings and have a couple of bullet points underneath them, purely because I think it gives you the option to tailor it to the role, but also to show your own skills. So I've given you an example here of a project management role. So if they were going to say to you in a project manager's interview, give us 3 reasons we should give you the job, the 3 things they're likely to be looking for is going to be something around your project delivery, something around your stakeholders, and something around the key projects that you've managed. If you were going for a receptionist job, for example, the 3 areas you might think are most important here might be your reception experience, it might be experience of working under pressure, and it might be something like working with confidential information or working with different audiences, different client groups. So just have a think here. What are what can you add to this section to really, really show your suitability? And again, this isn't one you're probably going to tailor massively, but it might be one that you just tweak to match the requirements of any application. Okay, any questions at all so far? No. Okay. Career history, as we say, once you get to your career history, the current school of thought is it's that top third of the CV that we've just covered that will be the bit that gets you the job. So your personal profile to introduce who you are, key skills to show what you can do, and then your career highlights or your key achievement section to kind of show what you can personally bring. Once the recruiter or the system has read all of that, the rest of the CV now is only backing up what you've told them at the top. So anything that's really, really important, anything you really want them to know, get it to the top. So when you get to career history, reverse chronological order is really important. So make sure you've got your most important role at the beginning. And then for every job that you list or every experience that you list, just include the following details. So your job title, your company, and your dates. One really important thing with the dates is to make sure you use full date format. So August 2022, not Aug 22, because some of the systems won't pick that up as being a full date, and it will highlight gaps in your career history, even if they don't exist. And then use some bullet points to show your responsibilities underneath. And you can have an italic sentence. You don't have to do this by any means, but you could have an italic sentence under each job to show the scope or the size. So an example here would be cashier, Barclays Bank, January 2019 to present. And then your italics could be worked in the Nottingham branch, providing account and mortgage information to customers. And then you'll have your bullet points, which will talk about what you actually did, what you achieved. So the beauty of that italic section, I mean, obviously Barclays Bank is relatively well known. Most people will have sort of an understanding of what you do. But if you worked for a company that perhaps isn't very well known, or a company that might sound very, very small, but might actually be part of a really big global group, then it's really good to have that sentence to add a little bit of depth, to kind of cover what you do. We just had a question on the chat, which is a really good question. How far back should your career history go? With the career history, the ATSs and the recruiters will give a greater weighting to about 8 to 10 years. So I would tend to say have about 8 to 10 years laid out like this with bullet point detail and kind of covering all of the information. What you could then do is have a subheading that says earlier experience includes, and then just have a job title, a company, and a date for anything else. So what you don't want a system or a person to be doing is looking for a skill and the last time they can find it is 15 years ago, because you're not going to weight very highly for that skill. So get all of your most recent stuff in. Obviously, if you've been temping and you've got, for example, 30 jobs in the last 8 years, you might just want to list it as temporary employment, various agencies, and then list all of your jobs under one subheading. But as a rule, it's a really good question. And as a rule, about 8 to 10 years is about right. Okay. Next section is your education and qualifications. Now you can rename this section. So sometimes people will call it education and qualifications. Sometimes it's education and professional training. If you haven't got any formal qualifications, you might just want to call it professional training, but have something on there to kind of show what you've learned, what you've studied. So again, the most important thing here is reverse chronology. And sometimes people's experience or education can go back a long, long way. And you don't want the first thing that they see to be, say, your GCSEs if you've actually subsequently gone on to do a master's. So keep your most recent at the beginning, and then detail it in terms of what you've covered. So you might have, like the example here, BA, Modern History 2-1, University of Essex. So they've got all of the key information straight away. What we often do underneath is to add a subheading here that says key modules included or dissertation title. And you can obviously add on any modules, any dissertations, if you've done any work experience. Sometimes your subheading at the beginning where we've got BA here might be professional training, and then you might just want to list any in-house training that you've done. So in a lot of jobs or a lot of, experiences, even if you're a member of kind of PTAs or voluntary groups, you might do all sorts of different training. So you can get all of those on there and just list them as being in-house training or professional development. So that's pretty much that section. And I would put everything under there, like we say, whether it's formal education or just ongoing learning. Okay. And then other information. So as we said earlier, sometimes you don't need this section, so it's certainly not essential to have it at all. But there might be other things that don't really fit anywhere else. Volunteering is another one that people often say, well, where do I put it? Sometimes volunteering can go under your career history. So if you're somebody that perhaps hasn't had a lot of paid experience, but you've had a lot of voluntary experience with some paid jobs mixed in, you might want to have one section just called professional experience and then put in brackets paid and voluntary and list them all together so it appears as a bigger career history. And sometimes your volunteering might be really, really relevant to what you're applying for. So you might volunteer perhaps in an animal sanctuary, and now you're applying for a job with the RSPCA and you really want it to stand out. So in that case, you could have a whole separate voluntary experience or volunteering section. So just kind of play that by ear really as to how relevant it is and what it is that you've done. Obviously, if you've got any publications or awards, you can list them here. Like we said earlier, if you're applying for a role that says a driving license is essential, you might want to put that in here. Or foreign languages are often a very good one. Okay, thanks. If anybody didn't see that on the chat, if anybody hasn't got microphones muted, if you wouldn't mind just muting yourselves, just because there's a bit of background noise coming through. Thank you. As we said earlier, hobbies I would generally not include. We'll have a look at this in a bit more detail on the next slide, because there is a way that you can word some of your hobbies. But if your hobbies are things like, going out for dinner, baking, reading, they're not going to add an awful lot to your job application. If your hobby is perhaps, I don't know, dog walking, and you're now applying for a role in a vet, that might be really, really relevant. So that might be a hobby that you want to keep. So with your hobbies, I would always say for every application, just kind of ask yourself, so what? What's that hobby going to add to the application? And if it isn't, take it off. Okay, so that's your other information section. So just some do's and don'ts, just to kind of summarize what we've said and to run through. So do tailor your CV for every application. Like we say, it doesn't mean you have to rewrite it, but do tailor it and just make sure you're picking up on the mirroring the language and the words in the job description. Make sure you're telling the reader what you can do. So if you were looking at this CV with a whole fresh pair of eyes, is it a good fit for the job you're applying for? A very, very obvious one, but one of the most common mistakes on a CV is check your spelling and grammar. There's a couple of tips that you can use to do that if you find it difficult, or even if you just want to double check it. Some of you may be aware on Word, there's a function called read aloud, and the Word will physically read your document back to you. Personally, I find it much, much easier to hear a mistake than to see a mistake. So that read aloud function can be really useful to pick up on any errors. There's obviously some other tools like Grammarly and some kind of different sort of apps that will also help you check that. Sometimes it's as simple as just asking a friend or a family member just to read through it. And very often, like we say, that fresh pair of eyes will pick up the mistakes that you can quite easily miss. And the other do there, give a brief description of each employer. So like we said, that isn't essential at all. But if your employers aren't well known, or it's hard for the CV to gauge the size of your remit, the size of the organisation, and sometimes it could be a really good idea to get that in there. And then the don'ts, like we say, don't use jargon, avoid logos, tables, fancy fonts, anything that will confuse an ATS system at all. So keep it very, very basic, very easy to read. Don't elaborate your achievements. Now, that always seems a little bit of a contradictory statement when I'm telling you to show off your achievements, but don't elaborate them so much that you can't justify them at an interview. Be honest, be truthful. Obviously, you want to sell yourself, and the most important thing here is to sell yourself, but don't get carried away in kind of embellishing various things. Don't use exactly the same CV for every application. So like I say, just scan through it, pick up on keywords, key phrases, anything particular that role is looking for, and just make sure that you've got those in there. Sorry, don't use underlines and bolds was the next one on there. You can underline a word or you can bold a word, but don't do both, because you will completely confuse the systems that will struggle to pick up on the font. So just some kind of top tips there, but it's everything that we've talked about today anyway. And then presenting your achievements. So this is the part that I think people struggle with most. It's really hard to write about yourself, and it's certainly really hard sometimes to sell your own achievements. So biggest tips here, as I said earlier, the absolute biggest tip I can give you is use enough words, use enough information to support the ATS. You know, technical expertise may mean something to you, but it won't mean anything to a system. You know, undertook the full spectrum of the role. You might understand that completely and know exactly what you did and exactly what was involved, but the system will not have a clue what you did. So make sure you've got enough words to back up what you're saying, and use words that present a positive approach. So instead of I helped, you could say I facilitated, or instead of I assisted my team, it might be I coached newer team members. To just kind of think about what message you're giving to your audience. Lots of people use measured in a CV. Measured's one of those funny words that it's very hard to sort of quantify what you did. So measured results, you know, I would go into detail. How did you measure them? Did you analyze them? Did you forecast? Did you calculate? So just be careful not to use the same words repeatedly, you know, break it up, tell them what you actually did in that section. And then instead of you being part of the team that introduced a new system, you could be instrumental to the success of the new system. So you're saying the same thing, but much more confidently and much more, you know, demonstrating your own role in it. And then use a variety of doing words here. So rather than, you know, I managed the process, think about your planning, your training. You know, did you resolve something? Did you present something? So think about your kind of verbs and how you can really use those, first of all, to show your contribution, but also to show the same contribution perhaps in a different way. You know, a different skill set will come from researching something as it will from negotiating with the audience. So really think about how you can present those words to give a kind of different angle to what you've achieved. And then when you're presenting that information, it's really important to get the key information to the front of the sentence. And this is something that never really crossed my mind until I started writing CVs. And kind of when you see it, it more or less becomes so obvious that you think, well, why didn't we do that all along? You know, my team introduced a system that saved significant funds, or generated £50,000 of savings working as a key member of the team. You know, what one will have the biggest impact on a recruiter or on the CV? So always get your biggest achievement at the start of your sentence. You know, your 50k of savings is much more impactful than my team introduced. Saved £3,000 by introducing a new booking system. Straight away, they know what you've achieved. Or worked as part of a team to review the booking in system, which saved £3,000. That £3,000 figure is diluted by the long sentence. One more there. In my spare time, I enjoy running, or raises funds for charity and supports the local community by taking part in running events. You know, it's the same sentence, it's the same skill, but it has much more impact. So just sort of think about how you're presenting your information, and if you can present it in a different way to get the message across differently. And then tailoring your CV to every role. This is kind of the biggest conversation that I have with people, and, you know, and hopefully you've sort of seen today the importance of picking up on some of those words. I would personally print out any job description or any application, get yourself a highlighter and go through and highlight everything that's essential and everything that's desirable, because they are the words that you want to get into your CV. So highlight the requirements of the role, think about the language they've used. Obviously, the key skills are really important. Look at the desirable as well as the essential. Obviously, you want to make sure you match the essential requirements, because that's what they need to kind of get through the shortlisting. But the desirable requirements can be just as important in terms of showing what a good fit you are. Think about the culture and values of the company. You know, one of the conversations I have with people quite a lot is they may have come from, like we said earlier, being at home for a number of years, and then you're going into a very corporate setting. And one of the things you might worry about is, well, do I fit that corporate, you know, that kind of corporate environment? People might be coming from a corporate sector and moving into the charity sector and worry about the change in culture. So if you can pick that up through your application to show you've got some experience or you've got some knowledge in that area, that's a really good thing to do. And think about the company goals and ambitions. If you're going into a very small company and they're planning to grow rapidly, and you've previously worked in a company that have grown rapidly, that might be something that you want to tell them, because it might be really impressive to your application that they're skills you already have. Most importantly, think about your transferable skills. This is something very often people struggle with. And I talk to a lot of people that say, well, I haven't really got any transferable skills because for the last 5 years, I've just been at home. But whilst you're at home, you might be thinking about things like budget management. You might be managing family diaries. You might be volunteering at your child's school or helping out elderly neighbours, perhaps. So there's a lot of skills that come from everyday activities. So you don't necessarily need to evidence every requirement of the job from a job. It can come from any range of activities. Sometimes when I'm talking to students and doing student CVs, and they'll kind of say, well, I haven't got anything to add. I just play football at the weekend. And I said to them, but think about the skills in football. You've got teamwork, you've got communication, resilience, reliability, dedication. There's so many skills can come out of different situations. And sometimes it really is just sitting down and kind of breaking it down and thinking, well, what did I learn from that? What did I get from that? And normally this is sort of easier to identify and to highlight than people expect it's going to be. And then when you're looking at your strengths and weaknesses, some of you may be familiar with this. It's a bit of a kind of corporate tool that sometimes you think, well, how does this fit into writing a CV? But looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and your threats, so doing a kind of SWOT analysis. So what are your strengths that you're going to bring to the job? Obviously they're all the things you want to highlight on your CV. Your weaknesses, you probably don't want to highlight in your CV. So you're not going to tell them on the CV all the things you can't do. But that may be something that as you're going through the job description, you want to make a note of, ready for if you get an interview. Because sometimes it's quite good to talk about, you're very likely to get an interview question around what will be most challenging in this role. And sometimes if you really identified the things that you're likely to find the hardest, it gives you quite a good natural lead to that question. And we'll look at that in the interview session in a couple of months. Opportunities. So just think to yourself, what are the opportunities this role opens up? Like you say, if it's a small company that's growing rapidly, there could be a whole wealth of opportunities. Equally, you may be somebody that doesn't want any opportunities. You want to go in, do your role, do it well, and go home, and you don't want to progress any further. So it's just worth kind of thinking about that when you apply. And then what are the threats? So the threats in terms of job writing sounds a little bit too serious. I mean, this really is kind of the deal breakers, the things that are really important to you. That could be the working hours, it could be the salary, it could be the working location. So just kind of have a think, does this job match all of those? And if not, when is the right time to raise them and talk about them? And again, we will cover some of that in the next session. So that's the end of the slide. That kind of is a run through to CV writing in a nutshell. What we'll do in a moment, Pippa and Kat, if that's okay, is stop the recording. And then if anybody's got any questions or anything you want to ask not recorded, we can cover that as a group. Is there anything anybody would like to raise now before we turn the recording off? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for attending and I hope you found it useful. My details are there on the screen and we will also send them around afterwards. But if you've got any questions at all, if you want to send your current CV over for me to review, I'm more than happy to review it and give you some feedback without charge. And like I say, we will pop some guides and some different sort of tips and advice around to you as well, that hopefully will help.